Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to sit down with Senator Carl Levin, the chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, to discuss the report and his thoughts on the lack of accountability on Wall Street. Senator Levin is the senior Democratic senator from the state of Michigan. He was elected to the United States Senate in 1978. For the past 34 years, he has led a vigilant campaign against economic inequality, and it's been a driving force for keeping powerful institutions and big business accountable to the American people. He also serves as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and was named one of America's 10 best senators by Time magazine. Take a look. Senator, thanks so much for visiting with us. We certainly appreciate it. This was a 2-year-long investigation. It was exhaustive. We're talking about 700 pages. You probably know more about the intricacies of all of this, and it's very difficult to follow. What were the startling, shocking things that you would say came out of this report?
How pervasive the conflicts of interest were up and down the line, starting from the issuance of mortgages all the way down to the selling of those mortgages in securities by Wall Street.
What about one of the things I think you've said is unchecked greed, and some of the people close to this say that there was greed on both sides, the investors and the bankers themselves. Do you think that's an accurate portrayal?
Yeah, I think that greed is a driving force generally, and that the government in this case cannot allow that to get to the point where the laws are being violated and where there's conflicts of interest and where people, firms like Goldman are actually involved in such a conflict that they gain when their clients lose. So greed is always going to be a driving force, but you got to have some constraints. There are moral constraints, value constraints, sometimes religious constraints. There are lots of things that need to be done to make sure that greed does not dominate either public policy or the activity of public institutions.
Michael Lewis wrote this book, The Big Short, and in it he talks about how some people analyze it that way, but he says that part of the problem is in many respects, when you invest, it's sort of like going to Vegas or Atlantic City. You're gambling, and if you can win or you can lose. In this case, you win whether you win or lose because the American people kind of shore up your bet. Is that an accurate way to describe it, and is that one of the biggest problems here?
That was part of the problem, is that when it came to the banks, that they could take high-risk deals and make high-risk deals. Number one, that were not benefiting their clients. That's the conflict of interest problem. But number two, where their bets were in effect going to be covered by the government. That wasn't explicit, but that's the way it ended up, because these institutions were too big to fail. If they did fail, they would have dragged the economy down with them. And in some cases had accounts that were guaranteed by the government.
This isn't the first time this has happened in the United States. We all remember the saving and loans crisis, the junk bond issues. It seems like there's these schemes hatched on Wall Street. The regulators are in place. Nothing seems to happen. Then there are congressional hearings afterwards. You issued this report. It's a year later. What's happening?
We passed a law called Dodd-Frank, and it was a highly contested law. The banks objected to many parts of it, but we were able to pass a law anyway because public opinion was aroused, and we got some changes made in the law. Basically, we deregulated Wall Street. We took the cop off the beat, as we say, or to put it another way, instead of having strong regulation to make sure there wasn't conflicts of interest or fraud or misdealing in the markets, we had relaxed the restrictions on our banking industry, and we paid a price for it. And so we reinserted more regulation or restrictions in our banking industry. We did a number of other things as well, but in terms of Wall Street, we basically put the cop back on the beat.
There's been kind of, I think one of the things that probably alarmed you and bothered you, though, is there seems to be this cozy relationship, though, between the regulators and the folks on Wall Street. How do you prevent against that?
There was too cozy a relationship here in two different ways. The regulator was the Office of Thrift Supervision that was supposed to regulate the bank that issued those mortgages to begin with. These were bad mortgages, which were then later on put into a security, which was then sold to the public. And then when that security went bad, people lost a lot of their pension funds and so forth. So the way we did it is we had an oversight hearing. We looked at the regulator. We subpoenaed them, had a public hearing. We showed what a lousy job they were doing. They were too cozy with the people they were supposed to regulate. And we ended up abolishing that regulatory agency. We just abolished it. And we turned its responsibility over to a much stronger regulatory agency. So that's what we actually did in the case of Dodd-Frank.
Treasury Secretary Rubin came up here and asked all of you to pass the TARP legislation. Of course, he worked at Goldman Sachs. This is well reported. His predecessor, Robert Rubin, also worked at Goldman Sachs. There's been wrongly reported that Timothy Geithner worked at Goldman Sachs, but his mentor was Rubin. It seems to me that all the people that come here to Washington that kind of have an understanding of how Wall Street works are all people who came from Wall Street. Is that something, or at least are tied to it in a way, is that something that needs to change?
I think there's too much of a connection, and that we ought to try to find ways of reducing that connection. On the other hand, the experience which is gained in business is valuable. So you do want a business experience to be available to government, but you don't want it to dominate. And so one of the reasons that you want to have, for instance, academic types or people who have been prosecutors, for instance, to come to Washington. You want that kind of balance. You don't want to preclude people who have been in business from bringing that experience, because if they have a public spirit, they know where the bodies are buried too. They know how a business can try to push the envelope or get away with too much. So if they really come with the spirit of bringing an experience where they've learned how businesses might get away with more than they should get away with, that could be extremely helpful. But in my judgment, we've had much too close a relationship between Wall Street and the government.